not just all the little tidbits that we hear about places we fear. He provides an up-close and personal look at the lives of individuals and families who called Cabrini Green home. He explored the strong sense of community and family that did exist, it really did, in the Cabrini Green development before its demise. I'm sure you also explored whether the demise was for the good of everyone or for that prime real estate. High Risers also documents the community's challenges from the perspective of its residents. He's a native of the South Side of Chicago, a graduate of Chicago Public Schools, and a Fulbright scholar. He's written about affordable housing and other pressing social issues for some of the biggest names in journalism: the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, GQ, The Atlantic, Wired, and the best American travel writing. He's a bit of a globetrotter. Among many other national publications, we are very proud to call him Son of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Ben Austen to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's good to talk after people have some food in their bellies and they're on their second drink. When they're on their third or fourth, that's not so good. It's truly an honor to be associated with Mercy Housing Lakefront and to speak in front of all of you. I'm a storyteller, and I wanted to tell a story of an odd chapter in our country's approach to vital social services. It takes place around 1990 at Cabrini Green. As Robin was saying, Cabrini Green, as many of you probably know, was a large public housing complex on Chicago's near north side, not too far from here. At its peak, it had 23 towers and a population that reached almost 20,000. All of it crowded onto just 70 acres. In one of those Cabrini Green towers, the residents took over the building's management. They were put in charge of a $6 million annual budget. They were responsible for collecting rents, screening and evicting fellow tenants, and doing the maintenance on all 15 floors. The president of this management corporation was a woman named Dolores Wilson. She had lived at Cabrini Green for almost 40 years, and she worked at the Chicago Water Department for just about that same amount of time. A few years earlier, she and her neighbors started their own security patrols of their high-rise. "This is where we live, and we have to protect it," Dolores said. She recruited children to help, attaching little pieces of paper with the word "monitor" to their shirts. The tenants fixed up the rec room and painted the stairwells. That's why they were selected for this curious pilot program of resident management. They'd already done so much to better their home. Other cities had also experimented in public housing with tenants taking over the buildings. Much in these efforts actually deserves to be commended. Resident management meant jobs and marketable skills for the tenants. Despite the myths of, quote, welfare queens, many people in public housing were eager to work. The idea was also born out of desperation. The buildings residents took over, these were the worst, some of the worst in the whole city. Towers and superblock public housing had some of the highest concentrations of poverty. The buildings had not been maintained. They were often mismanaged and ruinously underfunded. Elevators were habitually out of order. Work orders went unfilled. At Cabrini Green at this time, more than 1,000 units were left vacant. The housing authority never fixed them up and readied them again for occupancy. There were city officials and civic-minded nonprofits who thought the problems in public housing were utterly beyond repair. They considered demolishing it all. But then they surveyed the housing market in Chicago. They found that the number of families in need of low-income housing had actually increased during the 1980s. Affordable housing options had disappeared. The homeless population in Chicago and the number of people on the housing authority waiting list had both increased. It doesn't sound too different from today. If they eliminated another 30 or 40,000 units of public housing, where would all these people go? So instead, why not let the tenants take over the management of the high-rises? It was a stopgap, not a long-term solution. Resident management alone was never going to be enough to offset the years of neglect. The history of public housing's rise and fall is really the story of our country's always uneasy relationship to class and to race. And that's the story of America itself. Consider Dolores Wilson's life before she and her family moved to Cabrini Green. They lived on the city's segregated South Side. They had a one-room basement apartment. Their 5 children slept on a pull-out couch on one side of the room, and Dolores and her husband in a bed along the opposite wall. With that arrangement, I'm not sure how the last child ever got made, Dolores liked to joke. The Wilsons had tried to find a better apartment, but they were excluded from the open housing market. Landlords in other neighborhoods wouldn't rent to them. Dolores toured rotting cold-water flats near her. She saw apartments chopped up into multiple kitchenette units. Her greatest fear was that her building would go up in flames with her and her children in it. Without government intervention in some form or the involvement of nonprofits, private developers and landlords were never going to build or maintain anywhere enough homes for the poor. Unfortunately, that's as true today as it was then. At that time, public housing was the solution. That might be surprising to people. It would provide what Housing Authority called a decent, safe, and affordable home. When Dolores Wilson moved into her Cabrini Green high-rise in 1956, she said it was like heaven. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. President Franklin Roosevelt announced in 1937, the year Congress created the Public Housing Agency, the Federal Housing Agency. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Dolores Wilson and her neighbors trained as resident managers for years. What we did took longer than college, she would tell me. They studied best practices for conserving heat and electricity. They reviewed federal rules and regulations. They went over how to bill vendors. They were told they were undergoing empowerment training. The power to control your own destiny is freedom, an instructor said. It took Dolores Wilson and her neighbors 7 years to complete this empowerment training. And then they took over the management of their building. The tenant group opened a nursery in the high-rise. They built a playground and started a laundromat business. The resident managers were even put in charge of a $6.8 million full-scale renovation of their building. They were getting a new roof, new pipes, new kitchens, and windows. And like anyone renovating a home, Dolores and her neighbors obsessed over the details. They selected colors and styles, changing their minds 10 times before settling on their picks. Blinds, white Levolor, tile, mauve vinyl, elevator entrance, terracotta. Amid the public outcry over the state of Cabrini Green, their high-rise looked like new. Largely because of its location, really just a few blocks from here, Cabrini Green had become the country's most infamous public housing project. As a national news program put it, the very name Cabrini is synonymous with what many people fear most about urban America: rage and hopelessness spiraling out of control. Cabrini Green was a real place with severe problems. It had also turned into a character in the popular imagination. It was the setting of the primetime sitcom Good Times, of the horror movie Candyman, of documentaries, songs, and endless media coverage. If you stubbed your toe at Cabrini Green, Dolores Wilson told me, it was in the news. There was a recurring Saturday Night Live skit about a teenage single mother. Her name was Cabrini Green Harlem Watts Jackson. It was as if the public housing project was etched into some Mount Rushmore of scariest places in inner city America. Resident management at least demonstrated that there was so much more to public housing than just the horror story. It recognized the value in the people there, in the community. It saw that there was likely as many different stories of public housing as there were tenants. Dolores Wilson had chances to leave Cabrini Green. She turned them down. "I love my home just like you love your home," she would say. Beginning in the mid-1990s, the federal government started awarding billions of dollars to cities to knock down their public housing high-rises and replace them with mixed-income developments. Almost every city got in on the demolitions. Nationwide, 250,000 public housing units have been torn down since the 1990s. In 2003, at 6 a.m., the Chicago Housing Authority raided Dolores Wilson's building. City officials padlocked the door of the resident management office. They tossed computers and files into dumpsters. "Our residents deserve to live in safe, clean, and well-managed buildings," the head of the CHA announced. He was firing the Resident Management Corporation. "I felt it was the end," Dolores Wilson said. "If they could just come in and close down a corporation, they could do anything." Chicago is in the midst of its massive urban renewal project known as the Plan for Transformation. The effort would demolish every public housing high-rise for families in the city. They're all gone. The conditions that had led Chicago to try resident management hadn't actually changed. That is, there was still a huge shortage of affordable housing, a large number of homeless families, and a long waiting list for a public housing unit. So what had changed? Well, the country's mistrust of social safety net programs had gone mainstream, and the fortunes of cities had also improved. After decades of inner city decline, Chicago was beginning to flourish again in the 1990s, at least in the city center. The city's population ticked up in 1990 for the first time in 40 years. The anti-urban impulse that had sent middle-class families to the suburbs had reversed itself, and young professionals were flocking to city centers. The projects would now have to go. Chicago's reemergence, our reemergence, as a new economy global city depended on it. I started working on a book about Cabrini Green in 2011, when the last of Cabrini Green's 23 towers was being torn down. That final high-rise was Dolores Wilson's building. She was relocated to a rehabbed public housing development on the south side. Her new unit is much smaller than her Cabrini apartment. I can sit in my living room and cook in the kitchen at the same time, she likes to say. A majority of the families relocated from Chicago public housing took Section 8 vouchers to rent from landlords in the private market. Most ended up in neighborhoods not unlike the ones they left, segregated and largely poor. Cabrini Green did, in fact, need to be made safer and more livable, and maybe even replaced entirely with something better. But acting out of fear, spurred on by hopes of greater economic development, it almost guaranteed that those who lived there would lose out with whatever came next. Dolores Wilson is now 89, and she still takes the bus Sundays when she can to attend her church at Cabrini Green. Much of the surrounding area is nearly unrecognizable to her. Target built a giant store next to where her high-rise stood. Up the block, Groupon opened its headquarters. There's a skydiving facility behind what had been Dolores Wilson's building. People paying $69.95 for a few minutes in a wind tunnel to experience the sensation of free fall. For 50 years, inner city was a pejorative. It was a negative term meaning a place of danger or a scary black or brown place. Cabrini Green was the very embodiment of this notion. Here we are in 2018. The first 2 decades of this century, inner city has come to mean something else entirely. It now means wealth. It means a place few can afford. Today we're in an affordable housing crisis that seems as urgent as the one in the 1930s and 1940s when public housing was first created. Right now, only one of every 5 families poor enough to qualify for any sort of housing subsidy receives one. With rents on the rise in cities, half of all renters now pay at least 30% of their income in rent. A quarter pay at least half of their income. This crisis is by no means just a public housing issue. It's not even just an affordable housing issue. It's a civic problem. It's a democratic failing. In their desperate search for a decent, affordable home, the poor and middle class have been pushed farther from the economic activity and opportunities of city centers. As a country, we now have more people living in poverty in suburbs than we do in cities. There's actually something hopeful about this moment. Every city in the face of extreme inequality is wrestling with its identity, with the existential question of who can afford to call it home. As a result, more attention is now being paid to low-income housing than there has been in decades. It's getting prime news coverage. It's a pressing issue in city and state politics. Several Democrats in Congress have introduced affordable housing bills. With this renewed focus, there's an occasion to make a much bigger ask, to set an outer limit on the debate over affordable housing. Mercy Housing is certainly part of the solution. I've been in their properties. They have a beautiful residential building in the former Cabrini Green neighborhood. It's well maintained, social services are on site. We need more Mercy Housing. Please give generously. And we also need more low-income housing tax credits, more rental assistance demonstration, more vouchers, mixed income, more preservation of the remaining public housing stock. We need it all. But what I'm saying is, it's still not enough. It doesn't come close to meeting the demand. It all feels like triage, a stopgap, like resident management did. For decades, beginning in the 1890s, housing reformers, people known as housers, lobbied and shamed and advocated. And in the face of what looked like a humanitarian crisis, our country created something as monumental as the public housing system. If you view it as a monumental failure, that's fair. But the need for something that transformative, that remains the same. No one wants superblock public housing like Cabrini Green. But there's an opportunity right now to reimagine what affordable housing across the country could look like, to redesign more fair and equitable metropolitan areas, to share in the new prosperity. Housing is this fundamental building block of our lives and our communities. It's tied to public safety, to schools, to health, to work, to transportation, to private enterprise, the role of government, our values. The test of our nation, as Roosevelt said, is still providing enough for everyone. Thank you.
You caught me off guard. I was just getting my phone out to go to Amazon, see could I find your book. Because I'm telling you, your language is beautiful. How did you give that entire talk without once using the word gentrification? Right? Because some things just make people bristle, but you explained it all without that. Thank you so much. And the intersection of everything, because mass displacement causes internal violence and public violence and all the stuff that we deal with. So thank you so much. Very insightful. And I did know Dolores Wilson. So If you guys aren't inspired by that, you have fallen asleep on us.